Now, the VIX, quiet, getting a doji. It was up 3.5%, but again, we're still hovering below that 50 period, the green line right there. Again, the 50 is still above the 200, telling us again that we're at risk of a topping process unless that 50 ends up dropping back below the 200. So again, it's probably going to end up staying above it. Like I said, I still think the S&P will end up moving to new highs. I still think NASDAQ will eventually make its way back to the 20,400 area. They get a pullback or not. Watch that trend line on the NASDAQ that I'm talking about in the video. If we break above it, to be on our way. If we get a bigger pullback off of it, the momentum to break that downward trend line. So be paying attention to that. I'll be talking about that in the video here on the NASDAQ. Quickly, momentum continues to be bullish on the NASDAQ. The momentum line is bullish. We got these bullish signals. The cloud flipped back to bullish. Look at the background here. You got the shaded area, this gray shaded area. That's telling us something big is getting ready to happen. When we had it show up over here, we had the drop. We had the drop here. So it led to this drop right here. We had the shaded area over here, and it led to the advance. May not be done yet. Still working on it, but when it does finish, again, it's saying, hey, something big is going to happen. A directional move is going to happen. Seeing momentum go back into the positive region with NASDAQ here in the daily time frame. Here on the daily chart for the S&P 500, we never did see the background go back to red. It remained green with the pullback. We saw the cloud flip back to bullish here. We saw the momentum line turn back to bullish and the little arrow. Again, momentum's now going positive. So again, we'll see if we get a high this week, the Fed pivot, or do we get a pullback and then get a new high? But I think you got a good shot at getting a new all-time high. And the shaded area is telling us, again, something big is getting ready to happen. S&P daily chart here. The 4-hour charts turn back to bullish. Momentum and trend signals turn back to bullish last Wednesday. The very next day, we saw it turn on the daily charts. Those signals still remain bullish here on S&P 4-hour, being validated with the RSI being above 50. Even though NASDAQ sold off with Apple and NVIDIA, momentum is still bullish at this point. Again, we stalled right at that trend line that I talked about. We'll be talking about in this video. And again, we'll see if we can clear it or if we get a pullback and then clear it. Bitcoin's doing the exact same thing. Bitcoin's gotten a bigger pullback off of it. NASDAQ just a smaller pullback, doing the exact same thing. It's pretty fascinating. But the charts here in the 4-hour time frame still bullish at this point. We'll see if we get a pullback. The Fed or with the Fed, there's a disappointment. And then we'll see a half a point or quarter point, or do we just break out of this immediately and we're just pulling back a little bit? So again, I'll be watching this trend line to see if we break through it with the Fed, or do we get a pullback off of this trend line of resistance. Support the channel with the link directly below. That allows me to be able to provide you this information. Take a moment to do that. I'd really appreciate it. Follow the link below. It'll take you to a secured site and you can donate any amount you want. If you could take a moment to do that, I would really, really appreciate it. I thank you for that. Okay, it's going to be a busy week this week. We got the Fed rate decision, the options expiration. Start the week off, the Dow was up 228 points, up just over 0.5%. S&P was up 7 points, up 0.13, just over 0.1%. NASDAQ was down over 0.5%. The Russell was up about 1/3%. The VIX closed just above 17, up about 3.5%. We had Apple weighing on the NASDAQ. Apple shares slide as analysts highlight sluggish iPhone 16 demand. Apple lost $2.78%. It was down $6.18. It gapped lower, ended up rebounding off of the lows. It was down much lower at the lows of the session, but it had rallied back up to the 50 and the period as the 10 was crossing the 20, and it stalled there at the 50 and turned down off of it. Apple weighing on the NASDAQ and the tech sector pushed the MACD into negative territory today here for Apple. NVIDIA got a similar candlestick. Again, so did NASDAQ. A doji here, and again, turning off that 50 period, the green line there in the 20 period, 10 below the 20. NVIDIA down 1.95%, it's almost 2% there. Again, also weighing on the NASDAQ. NVIDIA down, Apple down. P managed to close with the positive close. NASDAQ, though, it closed off of the lows. NASDAQ 100 down almost 92 points, just under 92 points there, rounding up. Again, it got above the 50-period moving average and then kind of a candle indecision. Again, moving off of the lows that had hit the 50 down, but again, Apple, NVIDIA, and NASDAQ all recovered off of the lows. This week we had that momentum turning back up on NASDAQ. Because what I'm watching for is to see, surrounding the Fed, and get some kind of pullback, or are we just going to go parabolic? Because this is where I believe that we're headed, is this 20,400 area, where I think we're going to get a lower high, and I think you're going to get a double top pattern, very similar to what Bitcoin has. And right now, it's very interesting. NASDAQ and Bitcoin are doing the exact same thing. NASDAQ's turning off of this trend line right here. So if we get above it, then it can go parabolic if you can hold above the 50. If you start dropping below the 50, you can get a bigger pullback and build momentum to get above this trend line. Now, we are going to have the Fed rate decision this week. Again, the Fed's going to cut. If the Fed does a quarter of a point, the market's likely going to be disappointed, but then it'll rally after that. If we get half a point out of the Fed, the market will celebrate that, rally, but then have second thoughts about it and go, if things are so great in the economy, why is the Fed cutting by half a percent? So again, we'll see how it unfolds. But you've got the NASDAQ turning off of this trend line just over the 50 period. Bitcoin did the exact same thing. Now, Bitcoin is getting a bigger pullback and, really move back into a positive correlation. If we get a bigger pullback, I'll be watching the trend line right there. If we get a shallow pullback, then I'll be watching, again, can we clear this trend line right here? Also turning off of horizontal resistance right here, which again is exactly what Bitcoin is doing. We've had some levels here act as support, then resistance, and here we are just under that level with the trend line, very similar to the Bitcoin chart. Again, I've made it very clear what I think is going on with NASDAQ. Again, I do think if this is a first leg down that we have an A, a B, and a C structure going, as long as this trend line right here and this low can hold. After the jobs report, I would be looking for a bottom. We got it. We got that inside day right here that was confirmed with the CPI right here. And we had this big rally back up, exactly what Bitcoin did, overthrowing the 50-period moving average. Again, see if we build momentum and pull back to try to clear this trend line. Bitcoin's already doing it better than NASDAQ. Like I said, eventually I think we're going to break through this trend line. Historically, we have rallied with the Fed, as I've talked about, but the market is looking for 0.5%. I told you that I've changed my mind. I thought that that would be the case. We saw that be the case in 2001 and 2007. I talked about that in great length and detail over the weekend. That is the case. That will fuel the rally back up to fill the gap. If there's some disappointment on a quarter, we may sell off and then see the rally after that. This is where I think we're going right here, and I think when NASDAQ fills this gap and overthrows it, I think S&P will be topping about that time, but I do believe S&P will be making new highs. So again, we'll see what happens at this trend line. This is an important trend line now, and this trend line right here, trading range in a potential triangle. But like I said, I do believe that we will not make new highs. I believe the top was over here. I told you that on July 11th, pardon me, as I've been talking about for a very long time now. I believe we're in an ABC structure that will eventually finish in early to mid-October for NASDAQ. But look at this trend line. We're turning down right off this trend line. Look at what Bitcoin's doing. And notice the 50 period. We hit it today. We tried to drop below it, the green line right there in the 20 period. But then we got back above and we got a candle of indecision. Look at Bitcoin. This is pretty amazing. Bitcoin's doing the exact same thing as NASDAQ. Many times they have a positive correlation. More often than not, almost a NASDAQ ETF on steroids at times. Are periods of decoupling. Right now, have that going on between the S&P 500 and Bitcoin. But look at this. Bitcoin's turning off this trend line just exactly like the NASDAQ. It started turning there on Saturday and Sunday, and then here on Monday, we get another big drop, and we're breaking this trend line. So again, notice rejection off the 50, just like the NASDAQ. The 20 is still below the 50. On NASDAQ, it's right there at that same level. But I've talked about the bearish arrangement of the moving averages, suggesting we get a bigger pullback or a pullback. Now we're testing this trend line and slightly breaching it, pulling back to that 10 period. If we get a bigger sell-off, again, I'm watching this trend line, excluding the shadow. But again, notice the triangle structure. And again, I think that Bitcoin is doing the same thing NASDAQ's doing. And eventually, I think Bitcoin comes up here to this trend line or the resistance zone and gets a lower high. And I think it will complete a divergence. Sorry, I had to cough. Complete a divergence with the S&P 500 at that time. So I do think Bitcoin is in a bottoming process here in all likelihood, as long as these levels hold up. And I've talked about that in my last Bitcoin video. I'll link it at the end of this one, my Bitcoin video from Sunday. I didn't get a chance to watch that. We're getting a bigger pullback here on Bitcoin, whereas a little pullback trend line there on NASDAQ. It's similar. They're doing the exact same thing. It's interesting that they both bottomed at the exact same time there in early September for this higher low structure. They both got the rallies. They both have stalled at the trend line at the 50 period moving average. It's just Bitcoin's pulling back. So again, NASDAQ may get a bigger pullback. But again, when Bitcoin takes out the trend line, when NASDAQ takes out the trend line, I think you'll get a bigger rebound back up. Again, I believe Bitcoin has likely peaked over here, unless my signals, and go watch them, the signals in the weekly time frame all begin to turn back to bullish, and you get back above your 100 period moving average and stay above it. That's this line right here. And again, you somehow to dodge a recession and, the dollar collapse. So again, I don't think that that's going to happen. I think Bitcoin's going to price in a recession just like the stock market and have a positive correlation. So just want to share that with you. Again, very fascinating that both NASDAQ and Bitcoin are turning off of the trend line from their recent highs. NASDAQ peak in July, as we saw Bitcoin peak back over here in March, and there's been this short period of decoupling, and now they're moving back towards this positive correlation. So if we rally back up on NASDAQ, I think Bitcoin is going to rally up here to test this trend line or the resistance zone. But pretty fascinating. They're both turning off of these trend lines. So we'll be watching that relationship. Quickly, I want to talk about these weekly charts. I told you at the beginning of the previous week that we got a green bar on the Awesome Oscillator. This is a NASDAQ weekly chart. Again, I believe NASDAQ's going to go higher towards the 20,400 area. Whether it gets a little bit of a pullback first or not, a lot of a pullback, we'll see what happens. But I do think it's going to confirm a lower high. Talking about the peak over here, you have that longer term trend line on the weekly chart, and on the weekly chart we might just go slightly above this peak. But my guess is that we've peaked on NASDAQ. I don't think the S&P has. The Dow's been flirting with the trend line. The Dow's making a new high today. So again, continuing straddle along that trend line, that long-term monthly trend line, 125-year-old trend line. Again, if it goes a little higher, trend lines excluding the shadow and including the shadow, and continue to monitor that. But again, our second bar starting the week off here, and again, this causes me to believe that we'll end up getting a bigger rally on NASDAQ, whether we get a pullback first and then a breakout of that downward trend line, or if we try to break the trend line with the Fed, we'll see. I think that we're going to go back and fill the gap at 20,400. Still have a bearish reversal of conditions here in the weekly time frame. That'll probably turn back to bullish here going into late September or on into early October. Again, I think we will rally up towards that level. To clear the trend line I've talked about on the NASDAQ. In order to do that, our second bar here, though, I think will allow for that. While the bar is turning blue, the cloud is still red here on the NASDAQ weekly chart. Not so with the S&P. It turned back to bullish last week with our rebound. I told you after the jobs report that we had the rally the previous week. I told you I was looking for a bottom. We got it with the inflation data. I think that we're going to form this multiple point divergence right here on the NASDAQ. And again, you've got the bullish reversal of conditions going on here in the weekly time frame. And again, we're going back and forth, really just showing a sideways movement. I think that's suggesting a topping process. You're going from bullish to bearish to bullish to bearish to bullish. And I think that will end up giving us a new high. We did have the divergence here give us this nearly 10% sell-off. I think this divergence will give us a reversal, complete the topping process. Zoom out a little bit. I think that will allow the MACD to turn back up here and complete this divergence right here. We had this one, again, give us this sell-off. I think this one will give us a complete multiple point, a reversal, a triple negative divergence here in the weekly time frame. S&P weekly chart right here. On the daily charts, again, we still have momentum positive on S&P daily from Thursday, holding above the 10 and 20 period moving average. Bars green, MACD firmed up. So again, we'll be watching to see what happens with the Fed pivot. S&P daily here, momentum bullish. NASDAQ as well. Again, NASDAQ stowing at that trend line. We sold off, but again, we recovered off the lows. Again, after the CPI rally, we got above the 10 period, and then we saw the momentum flip here in the daily time frame. Remember, I talked about last week, it was Wednesday that we saw the momentum flip with the CPI rally for the intraday charts, and then on Thursday with the PPI continuing the rally, we saw the daily charts flip the momentum to bullish. So momentum remains bullish here on the S&P and NASDAQ here in the daily time frame. This is NASDAQ's daily chart. If we do continue to hold below the trend line, if we continue to hold below the trend line right here without being able to break above it, I'll be watching to see if we get a bigger pullback below the 10 period moving average, coming back to test this low or not. Again, Bitcoin's got that bigger sell-off ahead of the Fed. We don't have that with NASDAQ. We saw a pretty big drop there with NVIDIA and Apple. NASDAQ was only down just under 0.5%, 0.4%. It was down 91 points. So candle of indecision. Again, if we could break this level, then we could continue on in more of a parabolic move. If we pull back, then I'll be watching the 10 and 20, and I'll be watching the lows over here and this trend line right here connecting these lows as a level of support. So we'll be watching to see how it unfolds. Probably going to come down to, is the Fed going to disappoint with the quarter, or are they going to go and do the half? Of the opinion the Fed was going to do the quarter. I've changed my mind. I think they're going to do the half, and I thought Fed Fund Futures would begin to price that in, and it is now doing that, but you got to wonder, will the Fed appease the market? My guess is they're going to, so we'll see what happens. Momentum bullish still in the daily time frame. A lot of time over the weekend talking to you about Fed Fund Futures, probability of the cuts, and I told you we were at 53%. I told you I expected this number, this 0.5% cut to go up. This was at 53%. This was below 50%. I told you I thought that would change, and it did. So again, market, if the Fed gives the market what it wants, actually see the S&P rally to new highs. Historically, with the Fed pivot, we've had a big rally. 2001, we topped 19 days later, or getting a counter trend, and we had already peaked. 2000 got a lower high in 2001, and then we saw the crash resume. 2007, it was 17 days later. But again, if the Fed disappoints and only gives us a quarter, then we might see some volatility initially, but still go higher. As I told you, again, I thought this would increase, and it is. So again, it's looking for that 0.5% cut, and this is the betting markets here with Fed Fund Futures. Since I spoke to you over the weekend, we went from 0.25% having a 53% chance now to a 33% chance, and 0.5% is now at 67%. I think that will likely be the case. But if the Fed ends up disappointing, again, you could have some initial volatility with the Fed pivot, followed by the Fed pivot rally. Whichever way it happens, I do think the S&P will end up moving up to a new high. NASDAQ will end up closing that gap at 20,400 eventually. And I think that's probably going to be by early to mid-October. Historically, that has been the case, that we've gotten a Fed pivot rally initially, but then it fizzled out and we resumed the decline quickly. In 2001, the market had already topped back in March of 2000. It had sold off 19.5%. We started to rebound and we got the Fed pivot, got a big rally with it. Then we got a pullback. We got a pullback ahead of it. We got a pullback after it. But eventually, 19 days later, we peaked and we got a counter trend, and the crash resumed, and we ended up dropping, another 30+% Ended up losing about 51% on the entire decline. Just be aware of that. Again, the rally's been associated with that, but you've had some volatility associated with it as well. A rally, volatility. So we'll see what happens here, but this was a 19-day rally, almost 4 weeks. It was just over 3.5 weeks, 18 trading sessions. 2001, the market had already peaked and had dropped 19.5%. Cut here in 2007, the cut, we had some volatility just ahead of it and then kind of that line just like flat a little bit right below it there, but then we got that surge and we continued to rally for 17 sessions and we topped and formed a divergence. It was followed by a 20.5% crash, a bounce, the final exit point, and then the complete collapse followed, dropping 58%. But just keep this in mind that, again, the Fed pivot has been associated with rallies. We can have a little volatility like we saw in 2001 before and after or whatever. Here we had the volatility ahead of it, but and the sell-off ahead of it. But again, both of them produced rallies. This took the S&P to a new all-time high. 2007, it produced the top, followed by a crash, followed by a bigger crash, and dropping nearly 58%. Here we had already peaked. It produced a little tiny bounce, followed by a bigger collapse. And again, all over social media, how this is going to usher in the bull market for 2025, 2026. Market from 2022 is over. Bear market, major correction in the long-term bull market. Never dropped. Oh, we dropped 20%. It's a bear market. No, it wasn't. Never lost the 50-month moving average. Bear markets of the past have lost the 50-month moving average and the 200-week moving average. We didn't do that. 20% decline for a bear market is just some person's definition of it. That is absolutely meaningless. 5% in 3.5 weeks for the pandemic. Is that the shortest bear market in history? No. It was a crash in the longer-term bull market. So anyways, just don't lose sight of this stuff. This is what was going on with the cuts. This is what was going on with the cuts, okay? Historically, we've gotten a bounce. So even if we have some volatility surrounding it, if the Fed disappoints and only goes a quarter, we get the volatility and then we get the bounce. The 0.5%, then maybe we just soaring, get a little volatility, and then again see the S&P move to new highs. I'll be watching the trend line I've shown you on the NASDAQ and on Bitcoin. See if we can break through those trend lines with the FOMC meeting there on Wednesday. Something to be paying attention to is that this meeting is going to be associated with the summary of economic projections, and we'll get the dot plot outlining where the Fed thinks rates are going in 2024 by the end of 2024 and on into 2025. So this is going to be a pretty important meeting. Even if we get a 0.5% cut, that might initially be celebrated. The Fed's cutting, but again, what does it say about the economy if the Fed's having to, cut by 0.5%? As I talked about over the weekend, that was what has happened, kicking off the rate cuts in 2001 and in 2007. And again, we got those bounces. The narrative out in the social media sites, the Fed is going to cut. We're going to move into this new bull market. That we're going to have a soft landing. There's not going to be a recession. I talked about over the weekend, the recession indicators are predicting we're about to have a recession 3 to 6 months. It's 3 to 6 months away. Market will begin to price that in. So will Bitcoin. Narrative is all the Fed. They cut before when the markets were crashing during the pandemic. Bitcoin dropped 71%. S&P was crashing 35% or so. Fed can't do what they did back then. They can't QE infinity and beyond. They can't drop rates down to nothing overnight. Why? Because inflation will begin to rear its ugly head. And that's where people are missing it. They're looking at that one incident where we got all this artificial stimulus. You get artificial stimulus, artificial economic recovery. You get an artificial stock market rally. Things revert back to normal once all the artificial stimulus wears off, which now you're going to have the real recession we should have had. And why it's going to be worse because with all their stimulus, what did they do? They created a bunch of inflation. QE is inflationary. Government spending is inflationary. All those stimulus checks, that was inflationary. People, the government tried to help with those stimulus checks. They ended up hurting them, creating this huge amount of inflation. Yes, supply chain disruptions and other things were involved. There's no denying that the Fed, QE, infinity, and beyond, and the government stimulus checks and the crazy government spending we're getting, $7 trillion a year, more than any other time in history. All this is inflationary. Just be aware that, again, the estimate for the Fed funds rate is going to be meeting here, and the economic projections. Tomorrow, before the market opens, we're going to get retail sales. Last report we got, the market really liked it. It was that record number that we got. We got a better number than we've had very, very long time. During the week, we'll get the Fed there during the market session. Now, the S&P 500 NASDAQ, S&P gapped lower. NASDAQ down hard surrounding Apple and NVIDIA weighing on it. S&P went positive, and then it went back here on the 15-minute chart back to the 50, and then we bounced. We ended up 7 points higher. Again, as what I'm watching here is, do we try to go to a new high here now ahead of the Fed or with the Fed, or do we try to pull back? 2001, we got a rally, and then we had some volatility right after that, pushed on higher to new highs. 2007, we had a little volatility ahead of Fed, and then we just rallied again for the most part. So we'll be watching to see how it unfolds this time. But I do think the S&P will reach new highs. We got the Dow doing it up at that trend line there on the Dow, that longer-term trend line that I've been talking about. Quickly, this is what I think is going on. I think the S&P is doing something very similar to what we had over here. The S&P going into the 2022 high, for the diversions, it had some volatility. It rebounded back up. It pulled back, very similar to what we have right now, and then it went to a new high, and it completed this larger diversion. So we had that initial diversions, and it evolved into this larger diversions here in the daily time frame on the S&P 500. I think you have something similar to that here. The S&P turning down off of the, breaking this trend line and then turning down off of it. I think we're going to end up going back up here again. Maybe we pull back and get some initial volatility surrounding the 50 as we did over here. But again, I think we're headed up into this level, and I think we'll complete this larger divergence. And again, if we get a pullback, maybe it looks something like that if we just go straight up. But this is what I think is probably going to be the case going into early to mid-October. I think it will peak looking something like what we had over here, and the diversion something very similar to what we had over here. And again, this looks very, very similar to this right here. It's just a little bit bigger, and they both had this sell-off ahead of that. Look at that, very, very similar pattern to what we had over here. This multiple month topping process, and again, could have that here, and again, that sell-off that we had ahead of it for both of them, dropping below the 50, then getting back above it. Very, very similar. So that's what I do think is likely the case. We'll see if we pull back or not with the Fed, or just try to go ahead and make new highs with the Fed. However it unfolds, again, I do think you'll get a Fed pivot rally into early October or mid-October. Real important chart here, though, that I am watching with the RSI in the daily time frame. And then eventually, I think we'll head back towards this longer-term trend line right here, which will take us beyond that 200-period moving average. Really what happened in 2007, we reached a new all-time high 17 sessions after the Fed pivot, and then we came back and we tested that 200. We took it out, and then we tried to get back above it. That was a final exit point for the collapse. And again, very, very rapid drop. The October 11th high down late November, 5-6 weeks later or so. Pretty rapid drop of 20.5%. So I think we're going to see something probably very similar to this on the S&P 500. As NASDAQ is stalling at this trend line, along with Bitcoin, Bitcoin's had that bigger sell-off, but we're still stalling at this trend line for now. S&P is also stalling at a trend line, but it's just underneath its all-time high. Again, I continue to point out, I believe S&P will eventually make a new high, whether it pulls back first or not. We've had, again, big rebound. Remember, we got that 4.25% drop. I told you with the jobs report, I was looking for a bottom. Week we got a bullish inside day on Monday on both NASDAQ and S&P, and then we had the CPI and we had the inflation rally really confirmed that bullish inside day. Now we've come up here to this level. The red line right here is the gap fill directly overhead. So we'll be watching, do we clear this level or do we pull back off of it? You still have this 10 below the 20-period moving average, which is interesting. We've had this winning streak ahead of the Fed. So if the Fed only goes 1/4 of a point, it might disappoint initially, but I still think the S&P will move to a new high. If that goes with 0.5%, market what it wants, that can fuel a rally, but there's also some uncertainty as to what the economic projections are going to be, and also the estimate going to be going forward for the amount of cuts in 2024 and 2025. That will also be a factor in all of this. But again, we'll see if we pull back. We've had, again, this 4.25% drop. We've recovered all that and gone a little bit higher. We're directly underneath, and we're at this trend line here on the S&P 500. Things on the intraday charts. This is NASDAQ 60-minute chart. We reached extremes on the RSI. We pulled back here off of the trend line. So I'll be watching. Do we try to clear the trend line, or do we get a bigger pullback? We do. Again, we've got a trend line right here to be watching. Wherever it unfolds, if we can break the trend line, we could be on our way to this 20,400 area. If we get a bigger pullback, I think we'll reach it. I just think we'll see a pullback first. So we'll be watching to see how that unfolds. NASDAQ follow Bitcoin and get a bigger pullback ahead of the Fed pivot, surrounding the Fed pivot. But watch the trend line. Do we break above it? And if we do, be watching the 20,400 area. These other peaks, we form divergences. We don't have that yet here. Ultimately, I do believe we're going to fill the gap at 20,400. Interesting, we've rebounded back up. The 10 below the 50 in the daily, the 50 here below the 200 still. Here in the 60-minute time frame. Pring's starting to go positive here, though. So again, that could mean we could eventually get a bullish cross. But again, in order for the NASDAQ to go back and fill this gap, we've got to clear this trend line now. The NASDAQ reached extremes on the RSI and turned down. S&P is going more sideways. We're getting a pullback off of that trend line. A little bit here off of the trend line I mentioned right here, just right there, just right below it. And do these RSIs go down further? We get a bigger pullback, or do we try to break to a new all-time high? Here's the all-time high back over here in July for the NASDAQ. We were just shy of it here with this divergence. Again, we went sideways. Eventually, that divergence gave us about a 10% sell-off. I was looking for a bottom. We got it. Bullish inside day on the Monday, the previous Monday. Now we've had this rally back up. So I'll be watching. Do we try to go break that downward trend line immediately and clear the July high and move to a new all-time high? If we do, we'll be watching to see if a divergence develops or multiple point divergence. But I believe S&P is going to make a new high. Rally surrounding the Fed pivot, pull back, and then rally after it. The Fed ends up disappointing with just a quarter point cut. Regardless, again, I think that very similar situation as we did in 2001 and 2007. After that Fed pivot, we rallied 17 days and 19 days for just 3.5 weeks, or just over 3.5 weeks in the case of the 19 days. I'll be watching. Do we try immediately to clear this level ahead of the Fed or with the Fed? So does a rally continue in a similar manner that we've seen it do it in the past? Rate cuts in 2001 and 2007. Rate cuts in 2020, likely not going to be similar. The Fed's not going to just drop rates down to nothing, because inflation will rear its ugly head. The Fed's not going to back QE infinity and beyond with the stimulus, with the QE. Actually need a recession to help them deal with the inflation issue. So I'll be watching these 60-minute charts going into the Fed meeting. The MACD looks very, very similar here. And again, directly underneath the previous peak. The Dow did move up to a new high. Here's the Dow again, continuing to form this multiple point divergence on the MACD and the RSI. And again, long-term resistance, Dow, but like I said, there's some wiggle room if we include the shadow. But interesting divergences developing ahead of the Fed pivot here on the Dow. Could be the Dow peaks ahead of the S&P 500. I believe NASDAQ already has peaked. And one other thing, we're seeing this divergence between the Dow. The Dow is making new highs, the NASDAQ is not. We're seeing a divergence between the Dow and the NASDAQ. We're also seeing a divergence between the Dow and the Russell. This is what happened at the 2022 top for the S&P 500. We've got this series of lower highs, at least so far, for the Russell, and the S&P probably going to go make a new high I fixed my trend lines here. Sometimes you hit save on this program and the trend lines move on you. But you can see the divergences that we've recently had that have marked turning points for the short term. And again, a divergence forming between the S&P and the Russell. We have a divergence between the NASDAQ and the Dow, which is what we usually see at market tops.